Hi everyone. So today we're still looking at factors that influence on food selection and specifically looking at economic factors. So some of the economic factors that influence on food selection is usually the cost of food. So some foods will obviously cost more than others and that will impact on what families or yourself may purchase. So this usually is the case specifically for low income family earners where they will spend more portion of their wage on food. So some of the cost to food varies according to the amount of food purchased. So places like Costco, where things are actually purchased in bulk, may cost more, but if you determine it per kilo, it may actually be better value for money. The place of purchase, so if you're looking at regional versus metropolitan area, looking at the specific supermarket as well. Whether the food is in season will also impact on the price. Obviously, for foods that are imported from overseas that aren't in season are going to be more expensive than foods that can be harvested here in Australia. The degree of processing that the food has undergone also means time and labor and resources, which means the food is going to be more expensive. The age of the food, so if it's got a use by date or a best before date, and whether the food is on special at the supermarket. So this map here shows the percentage of food per household expenditure. So you can look at Australia, for example, is somewhere between 14 to 21% of the household expenditure is spent on food, whereas countries over in Asia have a much higher uh, con amount of food that accounts for their household expenditure, whereas America and Canada, for example, have very low expenditure. So there is actually a relationship between the socioeconomic status of the country and the amount of malnutrition of children under 5 years of age. So in places well, I guess first world developed countries like Australia, New Zealand, the US or Canada, and lots of parts of Europe as well, the rate of malnutrition is quite low. Whereas if we're looking over in South America or perhaps over in Africa, the percentage of malnutrition is quite high. So looking at the color code, and also there is a higher amount of food costs per income as well. So looking at the weekly spending in Australia, so how much do we spend in the household in different states? So Australia actually spends the least, only to be outdone by Tasmania. And then some of the products that we actually have in our household costs. So on average, we spend $44 a week on restaurant meals, whereas 20% on bakery products. So, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in 2015 to 16, food and non-alcoholic beverages made up 16% of household, whereas compared to back in 1984, where it was 19.5%. So we have actually seen a decrease in the percentage of money spent on food, and that's because we're seeing a larger increase in salary or wage in comparison to food costs. So this one is actually quite interesting to have a look at how much meat people eat around the world per capita, so that means per head. And Australia is actually the worst offender. So we eat 198.9 pounds of meat per capita. So that's a lot of meat. Um, and United States isn't far behind, but particularly if you have a look in places like Africa or also in India and those countries surrounding India as well, they have quite a low amount. And one of the things that does cost a lot of money is where your protein sources come from. So meat, although it is a complete protein and does include more nutrients, it is actually more expensive and does cost a lot more money as well. So there is a very nice relationship between the cost of food and oil prices. So, and that's really to do with transport of that food around the world, because that's something that has to be taken into consideration when you transfer the food from where it's grown to where it's perhaps stored and packaged, and then when it finally gets to the supermarket for you to then purchase. So the marketplace is anywhere that consumers can actually purchase food. So you'll notice that a majority of the marketplace is taken up by Coles and Woolworths. So they actually have almost 70% of the marketplace. And then you've got other places like IGA and Aldi and other supermarkets. So when it comes to the price in supermarkets, generally the smaller the supermarket, the larger the price for items. So you would have noticed, particularly with in like IGAs and Drakes, for example, the price tends to be a little bit more expensive compared to say Coles or Woolworths. And that's usually because the small stores buy from the larger stores or the wholesalers, and then the increase for buying it is passed on to you as a consumer. So supermarkets do actually use a variety of strategies to help influence the selection of food products. So they tend to have generic goods that are cheaper prices, more so than a popular brand. They also have your junk mail, which some of you may or may not be a fan of. And they also usually have displays that promote new lines of products or even perhaps taste testing as well. So the layout of the supermarket usually is designed where all of the most commonly purchased items are at the back of the store, because that means you have to go all the way through, which means you might think of some other items that you need to purchase along the way, which increases the amount of money that you spend, which is better for the supermarket. So many of the supermarkets now actually have a bakery and a deli as well. They also have a fruit and veg section so that all of your purchases can be done in the one place, which means they get maximum amount of money from you as the consumer. So I mentioned this before, 68% of the total grocery market is held by Coles and Woolworths. And that means they basically can charge whatever they want because they don't really have much of a competition in terms of other big producers. However, Aldi is starting to make a little bit of an impact, and places like Costco as well might actually change that as well. I did try to look for some statistics looking at how many people shop at Costco, but I couldn't find anything, but maybe in a couple of years. So, our resources are what influence our impact. So, resources could be something that doesn't just have to include money, but it can also include our time and our skill level as well. And these are basically this is your economic choices, which is the resources that you have access to. So, it might be money or equipment like food processors or a mix master. It's usually the things that you have access to. So the amount of supermarkets, restaurant, time, and then it's your personal attributes. So how much knowledge do you have about eating healthy? What skills do you have? Are you a good cook? Are you a hopeless baker? What kind of talents do you have in the kitchen? So time will then depend on family and work commitments as well as social impacts as well, and they will then impact on the type of meal that you'll eat. So sometimes you'll pick food that are more convenient if your time is limited. So looking at people I think this was in Queensland, uh, people are choosing to buy more pre-packaged ready-made meals, and most of them a majority of it is because they want to spend less time cooking or preparing food, so they're more likely to purchase ready-made meals. So some of them that have popped up in supermarkets is Foods and Thrive. They're an individual meal that costs anywhere between $10 and $12.95. What it includes, there's a bit of variety. It is supposed to be healthy as well, and some different places always stock it. So considering that the Australian household spends an average of $200 per week on food, this isn't usually a cost saving effort. It's more the timeliness and hassle-free nature as well that's attractive, which is why people lean towards this. And the same can be said for things like Marley Spoon or HelloFresh or Farmers Direct, where they are provide you with all the recipes, all the ingredients, and all you have to do is then cook it, which is not as time efficient as things like YouFoods and Thrive, but is still more convenient. So other resources might be money. So if you have more money, you might want to spend that money on other things like takeout. If you have limited money, then you're going to be using the resources for the government and charity groups. So things like Meals on Wheels. Your skills. So how good are you at cooking or storing food? How you exercise your budget to manage your time efficiently as well. So you might be really poor with your time management and therefore you don't have the time, which then impacts on what you can and can't have access to in terms of your food choices. So another resource is the food processing equipment. So we have a whole bunch of, I guess, small goods that we would call them in the kitchen that help us in preparing our food. So if you have, I'm sure some of you might have a freezer at home where your parents might actually buy food in bulk and freeze it, which means that they can keep it for longer and tends to be a bit more convenient and cheap. One of the things that I really like to do is actually do a whole lot of cooking on a Sunday, and then I put half of it in the freezer to have as emergency meals when I can't be bothered cooking, because then I just use my microwave to defrost it later, which is another convenience for food processing equipment as well. And a lot of these actually do save time and energy when it comes to preparing food, particularly if you've had a long day. So maybe have a look in your kitchen to see what kind of food processing resources you have to help process your food. So mixmasters, blenders, rice cookers, toasters. I'm sure everyone has a toaster, kettle, coffee machine, pancake maker. I mean, some of these are absolutely ridiculous, but you might have it. So the processed foods tend to be more of a convenient source that people that have limited money and sorry, limited time, but it tends to cost a little bit more because the processing means labor and is then passed on to you as the consumer. So other resources that might be useful include recipe books. So Jamie Oliver does a whole bunch of recipe books that are usually supposed to be meals that are 15 minutes or is 30-minute meals that are supposed to be healthy but also quick to kind of combat that excuse of I don't have enough time. Having a knowledge of supermarket specials as well, the government assistance schemes, and charity organisations as well. So the physical demand of the job as well as social expectations will be reflected in food choices. So the income usually determines the quality and quantity of food that is chosen. So families that are struggling to meet bills will have no choice but to cut back on their food expenditure. So often what they would like to eat and what they can afford to eat are two different things. So many Australians do have a dual career, and what this does mean is that they have better financial flexibility because you've got two people producing money to go into the bank, but they have limited time as a result of that, which means limited time for shopping and meal preparation, as well as less physical energy to actually do it, which does actually impact on the food choices, and they'll go for convenience because they have that financial flexibility. So they often use a large variety of convenient products, which I've already talked about. The pre-prepared foods that require very little preparation. So rather than making a sauce to go in your bolognese, I'd rather buy the one from Legos that's already prepared that all they do is just chuck it in the pot. Now those cost more compared to making your own, but time is money. They might also have restaurant meals as well, and they'll also dual career families tend to have more labor saving devices that help them with preparation of cooking meals as well. So what you'll notice is that about 26% of the weekly household expenditure goes towards takeaway, which is like, not insignificant. And you can have a look in the PowerPoint in Moodle for the week. What they have found is that Adults under the age of 34, which is the millennial generation, which is what I'm included in. Of course, you guys are actually Generation Z. Actually spend $100 per week eating at restaurants or ordering deliveries, whether it be Deliveroo or Uber Eats. And this is a massive rise of 37% compared to 6 years ago, where it was about $73. And you can see there's a huge, looking at the different generations as well. And it is a lot to do with convenience. So there's a bunch of ways that you can reduce your food bill. You can choose to purchase food that is in season rather than out of season, tends to be cheaper. You would want to buy foods that you can either use immediately or can store appropriately when they're on special, so you're trying to save money that way. Canned and frozen foods are often cheaper than the fresh variety and in some cases can be just as nutritious, particularly frozen foods. You'll actually find that the nutritional content of frozen foods and fresh foods, depending on how fresh it is, can actually be weighted in terms of frozen foods because they're picked and frozen at the peak of their nutrition rather than broccoli that's been sitting in the store for the last week and it's actually lost some of its water soluble vitamins because it's been sitting out and starting to degrade. So you can also buy in bulk and split the produce with families and friends. So, going to Costco, for example, is a good example of buying in bulk. And buying generic brands that are available. So going for Black and Gold or home brand over the more brand names because you are paying for a brand. Other ways include buying meat that's in the reduced price section. I remember when I went to uni and I didn't have a lot of money, I would be buying, I remember I bought, I think it was about $120 worth of meat, but I only paid $50 because it was all marked down in the local, I think it was the local Woolworths, and I froze it all and it was great. So, and I'm sure some of you move out of home and you have to really start thinking about your own budget, you'll start being a bit more savvy about your own money. One of the other things that you could do is actually substitute your meat for other protein substitutes like lentils or legumes. My twin brother was actually a vegetarian purely because it was cheaper to buy lentils or legumes rather than meat. He's actually does eat meat now, and that's because he's got a full-time job, whereas when he was studying, he didn't. You can also pack your lunches rather than buying them. I know that I'm guilty for that sometimes, which is why I tend to try and do the emergency meals in the freezer so that I can just grab one of those and let it defrost before I have it for lunch. Drinking water rather than alcohol, soft drink, or cordial. They all cost more than water and water's healthier for you as well. And choosing to cook and eat at home rather than eating out or at a restaurant.